Alright, so why is mixing in Dolby Atmos such a strain on your CPU? Now, in order to answer that, there's a couple of things that we have to be aware of first. So when we're working on a stereo mix, we're going to have two kinds of tracks. The tracks we've recorded are either going to be mono or stereo. Our buses are typically going to be stereo, maybe occasionally mono, and our master bus is always going to be stereo when we're working on a stereo mix. Now when we're working in Atmos, this is actually adding a third kind of track to the mix, which is called a bed track. You can more or less think of a bed track as like a stereo track but on steroids. And here's why. Because a stereo track is only processing 2 channels of audio. An Atmos bed track, on the other hand, is 10 channels of audio. It would consist of the 7 ear level speakers, 2 height speakers, and an LFE channel. Now with that in mind, now we have to take a quick look at plugins. Now just for example's sake, let's just use an EQ plugin. If we add an EQ plugin to a mono track, it's one mono instance of that plugin. And in either case, adding a multi-mono or stereo version of that plugin is going to be almost the equivalent of adding 2 mono instances of that same plugin. So generally speaking, it's going to require about twice the processing power of the mono instance. Now when it comes to working in Atmos, we only have to have one bed track. The master bus always has to be a 10-channel bed track. So now let's say we added the same EQ plugin to the bed track. Remembering that it has to now process 10 channels of audio, our simple EQ plugin is now the equivalent of either 10 mono instances of that same plugin or 5 stereo instances of that same plugin. Now obviously different plugins are going to use varying amounts of CPU processing, but imagine this EQ plugin was now a CPU intensive reverb plugin. Well, now you should be able to start to see why mixing in Atmos can eat your CPU real fast. Instead of just taking a hit on your CPU, it's more or less taking a friggin' sledgehammer to it. And the more plugins you add to 10-channel bed tracks, the quicker you're going to have no CPU left. So if you want to start mixing in Atmos, well, how do you get around this? Now the dumbest answer I could give you is just to go out and buy a more powerful computer. I mean, yes, that's valid, but I mean, how many of us can just go out and buy a new machine on the drop of a dime? So instead we need to look at workarounds and ways around this. And how to implement these different workarounds is going to vary depending on how much your computer can handle. So it's going to be different for everybody. So first and foremost, we absolutely have to change our buffer settings. Now when you're tracking, you want to keep your buffer setting as low as possible to eliminate as much latency as possible. But this also puts a lot of strain on your CPU. Now when we're mixing, on the other hand, we don't need low latency, we're already done tracking. So you want to go into your buffer settings and set your buffer as high as it can go. This will allow your CPU to more easily handle a lot more plugins. And now the rest of the things I'm going to talk about are just different suggestions, things that you can try to see what works best for you. Now again, in an Atmos mix, at minimum you're going to have one bed track being the master bus. You can use more if you want to, but you're always going to have one. But in either case, you're going to want to use plugins on these bed tracks very sparingly. Because again, say you put 3 plugins on a bed track, that's going to be about the equivalent of using 30 mono plugins or 15 stereo plugins. Now another thing that you can do is once your stereo mix is done, you can bounce that out into stems and bake whatever plugins you've used into the stems, and then bring those stems into a new Atmos session. And because what you've done in the stereo mix is already baked into these stem tracks, that'll automatically mean there'll be fewer plugins you need to use in an Atmos mix. Now if you don't want to sit and bounce out stems, and maybe you just want to make a duplicate of the stereo mix, convert that to an Atmos mix, and keep mixing but still have access to all the plugins you use for the stereo mix, it may just simply boil down to having to freeze all of those tracks. Now when you freeze the tracks, you're still going to be able to have access to the volume and the panning and such, you just won't have access to the plugins unless you unfreeze the track. Freezing tracks will also save up a lot of CPU for you. So mixing in Atmos doesn't need to cause your computer to burst into flames, it's just going to require some changes in your workflow. And how much you need to adapt your workflow is only going to be determined by how much your computer can handle already. The more powerful your computer is, the less workflow changes you'll have to make. Alright, so hopefully you found these tips helpful. If you have any comments or questions, as always, just leave them down below. And on that note, I've been Mr. Jeff. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys later.